Thank you for tuning in once again to Gods, Demons, and Magic. This is your host, Sri Sachinandan Das. We're continuing to explore the Egyptian mysteries by Iamblichus. In that ancient text, the Egyptian priest Abammon is explaining the supernatural world. There's a cosmic hierarchy of consciousness with gods on the top and mankind on the bottom. And Abammon goes into detail comparing and contrasting the gods with mankind and showing how they're different. The gods being exalted in consciousness and practically unlimited in knowledge and ability, whereas mankind being very much inferior and very much bound in their consciousness and limited in their ability. And so between these two extremes, then is the entire supernatural world filled with the daemons and half-gods. They exist in a spectrum between gods and man. And so by explaining the two extremes, Abammon gives us a picture of what this supernatural world looks like. A major difference between gods and man is how we fulfill our desires. So for human beings, fulfilling desires takes a lot of time and effort and energy and hard work. We basically have to struggle within the world. We're working your job. You have some idea, something you're trying to attain. You want to buy a sailboat and sail around the Mediterranean or something. You might work your whole life struggling, 30, 40 years, devoting yourself every day and the difficulties of working your job in order to save up enough money to do that. And even when finally you get that boat, there's so many imperfections in it. It's so incomplete. You have to put a bunch of work into the boat, or it has a leak. The boat itself, although giving you a little bit of pleasure, ultimately there's a lot of difficulty and struggle it takes to maintain it. And even that trip around the Mediterranean, it'll never be exactly what you wanted it to be. It'll never be how you fantasized it. So the difficulties with it will always outweigh the happiness from it. Whereas the gods, for them, it's like whatever they want, it just immediately and completely is fulfilled. Like they have a desire, they want to enjoy something, and they can fulfill it immediately. They don't even have to work for it. It just practically comes to them, and what comes to them is exactly what they wanted. Like they're completely fulfilled by it. And they do it all by themselves. Like we depend upon the world around us. We depend upon everyone cooperating with us to have our desires fulfilled. Whereas them, they're independent. They're not really bound by the world around them. Rather, they're the ones who control the world around them. And therefore, just all by themselves, they can do things very quickly and in a satisfactory way. The gods create things within this world, and they continue to dominate them, and they're benevolent towards them, and they guard them. Right? So they manifest something within the world, and then they have a very kind attitude towards that thing, and they continue to watch over it and to protect it, just like an ideal parent would. So the gods have this kind of parental feeling towards their creation. Whereas human beings, in contrast, we create things and then we become ruled by them. For example, you have cell phones, for example. Maybe 20, 30 years ago, very, very few people even had them. But once they become readily available, practically people are ruled by them. Especially if you look at teenagers, you can't even live for a moment, whether it's in a bathroom or in a car or wherever, without your hands on the cell phone and your consciousness absorbed within it. So there's a sense in which the things that we develop, or even, I say cars or something like that, the things that we create as human beings, we become dependent upon them. They control us in a sense. You see there's a lot of worry about this in human society. You've seen sci-fi movies like the Terminator series or the Matrix. There's always this fear of robots taking over, right? That's like one of Isaac Asimov's favorite themes. The idea that the things that we create will eventually come back to control us and dominate us and really become our gods. So that's the difference between us and the gods, is that we become ruled by our creations. And that's because ultimately we're very small and very weak, whereas they're continually in control of everything they create. And so Abammon continues to describe that the gods are independent of humans, whereas humans are dependent upon the gods. So basically they don't need us. As we mentioned before, there's a relationship of sacrifice, but they're not really dependent upon us, but we're actually dependent upon them for our pleasures. The various things that are true wealth within the world, such as clean water, clean air, regular climate cycles, like proper winter, summer seasons, etc., proper rain, the withholding of rain, all of these things upon which our lives depend are in the hands of the gods, and it depends upon their pleasure that things will go nicely. Now, this is another interesting thing Abammon describes, is that the consciousness of the gods is much different than the consciousness of mankind. For the gods, in a single moment, they can grasp the end of all energies and essences. There's a sense in which their consciousness pervades throughout nature itself, that very nature that they assisted to create and in which they dominate. And they can sense and understand the various aspects of the world. They can become conscious of their consciousness expands throughout the entire universe, and especially into those things of which they are a controller. So, for example, just like you may, kick your toe on a door jamb or something like that, and immediately you feel, your consciousness goes there. It's part of your body. You can feel that pain. Your consciousness is expanded throughout the entire body, and whatever's going on in your body, you can experience it. Whereas the gods, their consciousness expands beyond their body and goes throughout the universe. And so therefore, for example, the fire god may become conscious of fire anywhere it exists in the universe, It's kind of like when you interact with the fire god can feel that. It's like part of his body, and his consciousness extends all throughout the universe to that element of fire. Whereas we're only consciousness to, our consciousness only expands to where our bones and blood and skin and fat and marrow and all of that stuff expands. So there's a great difference in the level of expansion of our consciousness, and whereas the gods are conscious, their consciousness expands throughout reality itself. And similarly, the gods can hear our prayers when they're offered. You can directly call their name or chant a particular hymn, and they can become conscious of that. And another difference is that human beings, our consciousness is very limited. In fact, we can become conscious only of one thing at a time. If you notice, this is something kind of interesting to observe. If you notice even that you can only focus your mind on one of your senses at once. For example, you can either pay attention to what I'm saying, through your ears. If you listen very, very hard, you'll notice that everything else starts to become minimized. Like for example, if you're driving a car and you're listening very intensely to my voice or to some music or something, practically everything that you may see with your eyes vanishes. Like you're conscious of it in a very low level way. It's sort of like on autopilot. But in many ways you can be absorbed totally into like a daydream, where you're not even seeing and you don't even remember, how you got so far on the freeway, because you've been so absorbed in hearing that your mind has, in essence, been turned away from the eyes and is absorbed fully in the ears. Or similarly, maybe an accident is about to happen, and you have to turn the steering wheel and you have to like grip it hard and take your foot off the gas and poise it above the brake, and immediately your consciousness goes away from what you're hearing and towards what you're seeing, and your mind is absorbed in what your eyes are seeing. And you're watching very carefully until the danger has passed, and then you realize, I got to rewind now. I have to go backward in the song or backward in the podcast or something and catch what I missed, because the mind can only really absorb in one sense at a time, or the sense of smell. For example, you have a wine taster or something. He or she is putting the nose to the glass and closing the eyes and, smelling very intensely. The idea is that you're tuning out all the other sensual experiences and focusing the mind directly on the glass of wine. So human consciousness, not only is it limited to our physical body, we can only experience things through, to the extent of our body. Similarly, we can only focus our consciousness through the mind on one sense at a time, either on the ears, the nose, on the tongue, on the skin. So in this way, the human form of life is, in a sense, a very narrow experience of consciousness. Consciousness is narrowed by the human form of life into a very fine, focused, you might say, slice of the spectrum of reality. The human body itself is only able to capture a very small piece of reality. Whereas the gods, their consciousness expands on a much broader level throughout reality. A good example would be to look at the electromagnetic spectrum. You have on one extreme, you have cosmic rays and gamma rays and X-rays and ultraviolet rays, radiation essentially. And on the other end, you have radio waves and microwaves. And in the middle of this spectrum, in a very small band, you have visible light, which is what human beings can see. And so as human beings, as a spark of consciousness embodied in this human form of life, we can only see through our eyes a very small piece of this electromagnetic spectrum, this kind of this field of vibration that we're situated within. And our consciousness is really bound by the human form of life to only experience a small piece of reality. Whereas you look at other forms of life, like if you were embodied as a butterfly, you would have a completely different view of reality. Perhaps you'd be able to see into the ultraviolet spectrum. It would look like, a psychedelic experience, like a Jimi Hendrix album cover or something, with all the various colors and lights and things. And so all the different bodies, they're a different experience of the same reality because they're a different set of senses. And so the human form of life is a very small, kind of narrow experience of reality, whereas the gods, their body is very different than ours, and they can see a much broader picture, for example, of the electromagnetic spectrum. Like their picture of reality, it encompasses the universe at a much higher level, and therefore they see reality different than us. You might say, like, the world that we live in, with the spherical planets and, with outer space and the sun and everything and the order that we're familiar with, the gods see reality at a much different level. And oftentimes when you look at the ancient scriptures of the world and their descriptions of the universe, which obviously look much different than the ones we live in, oftentimes it's considered to be that's the universe from the perspective of the gods. Like they see the universe on a much different level, a much broader level. It's a completely different experience of the same reality. And also the different literatures dealing with self-realization, such as those talking about yoga, etc., oftentimes they describe that through mystical union with the divine, or realization of the absolute truth, elevation of consciousness, you can move beyond simple human consciousness. The consciousness which is bound as a soul within the human form of life and experiencing reality through the slim sort of window of human existence. It can actually expand beyond human existence through the elevation of consciousness, and you essentially become no longer human. Like you're elevated beyond human consciousness, and you can perceive the world as the gods perceive it. And therefore enlightened sages and seers and rishis, they oftentimes have mystical experiences of the gods. They can not only see the world as the gods see it, but they may even see the gods or interact with the gods. In fact, in the ancient literatures of India, it describes that in ancient times and previous times, in just the natural form of human consciousness was much higher, much closer to the gods. Human consciousness, the picture of reality they experienced was much bigger and higher and more elevated, and therefore they would interact with the gods. Like they might have a ritual where they call down the gods for, worship and to ask benedictions, and they would actually experience and see the gods actually coming. Here they come down from the on their blazing chariots down from the sky and actually attend the ritual. And so that requires a much higher form of consciousness than we as human beings have now. So there's a sense in which in ancient times human consciousness was much more expanded and had a much different vision of reality, more similar to that of the gods, and was able to interact with the gods more easily because of that. And so there's a sense in which the different perspectives on reality is nothing but the expansion of consciousness. Those beings that are sort of, their consciousness is very narrow and small and limited very heavily by matter are within bodies such as the bodies of animals. And then mankind is, slightly more elevated in consciousness, a much clearer perspective on reality, a much broader perspective on reality. And then you have the gods themselves have a very elevated form of consciousness which can perceive reality on a much higher level. But what's going on is that it's the consciousness or the soul within is the same no matter what, and these are just different levels of elevation of the soul's consciousness, or you might say freedom of the soul's consciousness to perceive things clearly, a less inhibited, less bound, less binding body where the soul can naturally shine out. And so the bodies of the gods are considered to exist on a higher level of perfection, whereas the human form of life is one that is not quite as perfect, but is striving upwards towards perfection, sort of climbing upwards and developing consciousness like that of the gods. That's really essential to human life. Another difference described by Abammon here is that the humans are bound by form, and the gods are not bound by form. Like we're pretty much in our body. There's not much we can do. There's, of course, people talk about astral projection and things like that. But the gods, they're not bound by form. They can actually change their form at will. Like a god can come to you as a beautiful man or woman, or they can come as an animal or as a spirit or anything, just as a disembodied voice. And also the gods, being of higher consciousness, they delight in things which are superior to them, especially the absolute truth or Brahman or the one or the good. The gods are absorbed in these things, whereas human beings, we become engrossed in things which are inferior to ourselves. We become attached as souls within the body of a human being. We have this tendency to be drawn downward in consciousness and to be attracted to gross physical matter, which is below us as spiritual beings. And therefore we have this tendency to kind of become dominated by things which are beneath us. And the gods have dominion of nature itself, and this is based on the authority of the supreme cause, or the one, or the good, or God, is essentially given the gods the power to dominate the world and to control it. Whereas human beings, just as our consciousness is bound in a smaller form, which experiences a smaller slice of reality, so similarly we have only dominion over that very small portion. We only have dominion over that which we can control, and even that control that we may exert is not so good. Like for example, how many of us actually have control over our health or over our body? Even our body itself is out of our control. We can try our best to follow a health regimen, but disease will come. Or we can try our best to control our family or our children, our husband or wife, but ultimately, as we mature, we have to sort of let go of these things and not try to dominate and control, because you can't. Ultimately, life itself is moving, whether we like it or not, and we really don't have that much of a say. And so with human beings, our level of control of reality is actually quite small. Whereas with the gods, they directly have control. And that's, in essence, that power is given to them by the supreme cause or by God himself. And they exist ultimately as manifestations of the power of God, or their souls embodied within, you might say, certain powers of God himself. And therefore, that's why they have such tremendous power. It's like they're given that position. And ultimately they do it as a kind of service. Because they are benevolent, and it's because of that quality of character that they're given such a responsibility. And so you have these two extremes. You have the practically liberated gods who are filled with knowledge and kindness and benevolence, who are able to fulfill their desires immediately. They control nature, but they're very kindly disposed towards the universe, and they're free. In many ways they're much freer than we are. Whereas then you have within human consciousness, you have a lot of bondage and struggling and suffering, as well as a lot of ignorance about reality. And after all, we're very small within the world, but we are in a sense the sort of like on the bottom of the totem pole of consciousness. But we're a form of life which naturally rises up and rises up and rises up. Like we have the propensity to raise and elevate our consciousness towards that of the gods. And then between us and the gods, you have all of the daemons and half-gods. And if you understand the nature of the humans and the gods, you can see that they exist sort of like in between, at various levels. Some are closer to the gods and further from man, and some are further from the gods and closer to man. But it's a kind of, stepping up, step after step after step, sort of like the stairway to heaven, moving upward from human consciousness to God consciousness. And all of these different entities exist on different steps. So thank you very much for listening. If you found value in this, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, please visit srisachinandan.com/iTunes and leave a positive review. Please check out my newest podcast, Light of the Vedas, wherein we focus on unraveling the mystical literatures of ancient India. Thank you again, and we hope that you'll join us next time on Gods, Demons, and Magic.